He refused to leave the collapsing flood zone, his paws planted firmly against the raging waters. What was he hearing beneath the rubble that no one else could? Just when rescuers were about to turn back, a faint cry shattered the storm's roar. Here's what happened, but before we get into the story, drop a comment below. Let us know where you're watching from. The wind screamed through the shattered alleyways as if mourning the town's impending doom, and every instinct in Harding's battle-hardened mind told him to pull back before the flood swallowed them whole. But Valor's stance told a different story. The dog's paws dug into the slick, unstable ground at the water's edge, his body trembling not with fear, but with relentless purpose. His nose lifted high, catching something in the chaos that no human could sense. Harding wiped the rain from his eyes, scanning the jagged silhouette of the flood zone, where houses once stood proud and whole, but now leaned like drunken skeletons against the merciless current. Then, just beyond the shattered remains of a playground, the swing sets twisted and groaned against their chains, and Valor let out a low, guttural growl that vibrated through the air like a warning bell. Harding knew that sound. It was the same growl Valor had given in the war zones when danger was hiding just out of sight, moments before all hell broke loose. His hand moved instinctively to Valor's harness, his voice low and steady despite the chaos. "Easy, boy. Show me," he muttered, his heart pounding against his ribcage like a war drum. Valor pulled hard, almost dragging Harding forward, his muscles rippling beneath his soaked fur as he locked onto a path that seemed suicidal to any sane man. But Harding wasn't thinking about safety anymore. He was thinking about the unaccounted for, the ones still out there, and whatever it was that Valor refused to leave behind. The water surged around them, bitterly cold and filled with the stench of oil and broken memories, each step harder than the last as the current fought to drag them under. Harding's boots scraped against submerged debris, splintered furniture, broken glass, the remnants of lives lived and lost in a matter of hours. Then, through the blinding rain, a distant sound caught his attention. Faint, fleeting, almost impossible to hear over the storm's rage. A voice, small, fragile, and so heartbreakingly alone. Harding froze, his eyes locked on Valor, who had already turned his head in that direction. His ears standing tall against the storm, his bark sharp and decisive as he lunged toward the sound. In that moment, Harding didn't hesitate. Every ounce of training, every moment of fear and courage from years in uniform surged through him as he followed Valor into the unknown, into the very heart of the flood's relentless grip, knowing that whatever awaited them beyond the water and wreckage would either be a miracle or a tragedy written too late. And as the storm roared above them, drowning out the last echoes of a once peaceful town, Captain Luke Harding pressed forward, his mind racing with a single desperate hope that it wasn't too late. Captain Harding's boots splashed into the swirling chaos as he fought his way toward Valor, every muscle in his body straining against the violent current that seemed hell-bent on pulling him under. The cold was unforgiving, biting through layers of soaked clothing, numbing his hands as they clawed at floating debris that slammed against him with every surge of the floodwaters. But the only thing louder than the storm was the pounding in his chest and the frantic rhythm of Valor's barks, each one more desperate than the last, as if the dog knew that every second wasted was a second closer to death for whoever was trapped beneath that wreckage. Harding's mind pushed aside the cacophony of sirens and the crackle of his abandoned radio, focusing only on the impossible task ahead. The collapsed house before him was a mangled skeleton of beams and shattered memories, its walls half submerged and trembling under the relentless force of the storm. Valor stood atop a cracked concrete slab, his front paws braced against a jagged hole where the structure had caved in, his muzzle shoved deep into the dark void, barking with a wild, unrelenting urgency that sent a fresh wave of panic through Harding's veins. Harding pressed his ear against the opening, straining to hear through the relentless roar of rain and water, and there, so faint it felt more like a memory than a sound, a muffled, fragile cry. "Help, please!" The voice was barely a whisper, but it hit Harding like a freight train. A desperate plea swallowed by the storm, but heard loud and clear by a man who had promised himself he would never leave anyone behind. He dropped to his knees, ignoring the icy water lapping at his chest, and began tearing at the debris with raw, bleeding hands. Every plank he moved, every beam he shifted, threatened to collapse the fragile space where that tiny life clung to hope. Valor didn't leave his side, his body pressed close, his sharp senses guiding Harding's trembling hands toward the exact spot where that voice had come from. The wreckage groaned ominously, a deep, gut-wrenching sound that signaled the entire structure could come down at any second. But Harding didn't stop. He couldn't. Not when there was a child's life hanging in the balance. Splinters tore into his palms as he ripped away another chunk of sodden wood. And then he saw it. A small, dirt-smeared hand reaching through the darkness, fingers trembling with the last remnants of strength. "I've got you!" Harding shouted over the storm, his heart nearly breaking when he saw the child's wide, terrified eyes staring back at him from the shadows. "Just hold on, sweetheart. I'm not leaving you." But as he reached in to pull her free, a loud crack split the air, and the remaining beams above them shifted dangerously, sending a shower of debris crashing into the water beside them. Harding's blood turned to ice. There was no time, no margin for error. Either he got her out now, or they would all be buried beneath the crushing weight of the flood and ruin. And as the storm raged on, Captain Harding tightened his grip on the child's tiny hand and prepared to fight against impossible odds one more time. Harding's breath came in ragged gasps, the freezing water soaking through every layer as he fought against both the storm and the unrelenting clock ticking down a life trapped beneath the wreckage. His bloodied fingers trembled as he ripped away another jagged plank, each movement threatening to send the remains of the house collapsing into a watery grave. Valor's whines turned into sharp, anxious barks, his paws scraping at the splintered beams with frantic precision, as if the dog understood just how little time was left. Harding pressed his face close to the small opening where that fragile hand had appeared, his eyes scanning the darkness until they locked onto wide, terrified eyes glinting faintly in the dim light. Her lips quivered, her voice barely audible over the pounding rain. "Please, don't leave me," she whispered, her words like a dagger twisting in Harding's chest. "I'm right here, sweetheart. I'm not going anywhere," he rasped, his throat raw from shouting against the storm. But even as he spoke the words, the structure groaned under its own weight, the timbers above them shuddering violently with each gust of wind. Harding knew the next shift could bring the whole thing down. He reached through the narrow gap, his fingers brushing against the girl's trembling arm. She was wedged between broken beams, a fallen support pinning her legs in place. Harding pulled back and glanced at the rotted wood above, every instinct screaming that they had only moments before it all gave way. Gritting his teeth, he shoved his arm deeper into the gap, his shoulders scraping against jagged edges as he reached for her. "You have to trust me now," he said, his voice low and commanding, despite the terror clawing at his mind. The girl nodded weakly, her tiny fingers clutching his with the last of her strength. With a deep, agonizing breath, Harding pulled, feeling the resistance of whatever trapped her legs. Valor barked again, loud and piercing, and Harding saw the beam starting to shift above them, groaning like a wounded giant about to collapse. "Come on, baby girl, come on," he growled through clenched teeth, his muscles straining as he wrenched her free with a final, desperate pull. She cried out in pain as her legs scraped free, but then she was in his arms, her frail body pressed against his chest as he backed away from the collapsing wreckage. Valor barked again and leapt ahead, his instincts screaming that the time to run was now. Harding didn't hesitate. Cradling the girl against him, he pushed through the waist-deep water, his legs burning with the effort as the storm howled its fury. Behind him, with a final shuddering groan, the remains of the house gave way and collapsed into the floodwaters with a deafening roar, sending a wave of debris crashing through the street. But Harding didn't look back. He focused only on the fragile heartbeat against his chest, the small gasps of life he had fought so hard to save. And as the water swirled around them and the night raged on, Captain Luke Harding kept moving forward, because stopping was not an option. Not now, not ever. Harding's pulse thundered in his ears as he watched Valor disappear beneath the shifting wreckage. The dog's lean, battle-hardened frame squeezing through the impossible gap with the singular focus of a soldier obeying his final command. The storm raged above, winds howling like the cries of 1,000 lost souls, and the wreckage groaned under the weight of its own impending collapse, every beam trembling with the threat of a deadly final surrender. Harding crouched low, his muscles coiled and burning, eyes locked on the narrow opening where Valor had vanished, praying to every higher power he'd ever doubted that his partner would come back through that hole alive. Seconds felt like hours, the air so thick with tension it became a physical weight pressing down on Harding's chest. But then, through the chaos, a muffled bark echoed from deep within, strong and insistent, a beacon cutting through the storm's madness. Harding scrambled forward, his raw, bloodied hands tearing at the debris with reckless abandon, fueled by the sound of Valor's voice and the fragile hope that still flickered like a dying flame in the darkness. The wreckage shifted ominously as he threw his shoulder against a heavy beam, every muscle screaming in protest. And with a final, desperate heave, he pushed it just far enough to catch sight of what he had prayed so hard to see. A small, mud-caked face, eyes wide with terror, and those tiny arms wrapped in a death grip around Valor's thick, scarred neck. Harding's breath hitched in his throat, relief and horror crashing over him in a violent storm of emotion. She was alive, but the walls were closing in fast. "Hang on, sweetheart. I'm coming," he rasped, his voice raw and ragged from shouting against the storm. Valor remained perfectly still, his strong body shielding the girl as the wreckage creaked above them like the final groan of a dying beast. Harding reached in, his hands brushing against the girl's trembling arms. "I need you to be brave now, okay? I'm going to pull you out," he said, his voice low and steady despite the panic clawing at his throat. The girl nodded, her tear-streaked face barely visible in the flickering light, and Harding took a deep breath, bracing himself as he pulled with everything he had. Valor didn't move, didn't flinch, his eyes locked on Harding's as if to say he wasn't going anywhere until the child was safe. Harding felt the girl's small body slide free, her fragile sobs cutting through the roar of the storm as he lifted her into his arms, shielding her against his chest. He turned back for Valor, but before he could call out, the wreckage shuddered violently, a thunderous crack splitting the air as the supports began to fail. "Valor, move!" Harding shouted, his voice breaking with desperation. But the brave Malinois remained rooted in place, bracing his body against the collapsing beams to give them just a few more precious seconds. And in that heartbeat between life and death, Captain Luke Harding realized that his loyal partner wasn't just holding up the wreckage. He was holding the line between hope and despair, between salvation and sacrifice. And the storm wasn't done testing how far a hero would go to save a life. The air seemed to shatter as the structure gave its final groan before collapsing in on itself, a deafening roar that drowned out even the fury of the storm. Harding felt the ground tremble beneath the surge of water, the sheer force of the collapse sending a wall of debris-laden floodwater cascading toward them like a tidal wave determined to erase everything in its path. Clutching the terrified girl against his chest, he spun toward Valor, his heart splitting at the sight of the dog standing unmoving, a living bulwark between the child and death itself. "Valor, move!" Harding's voice cracked with desperation, his hands slick with blood and rain as he lunged forward, muscles burning, lungs on fire. Every instinct screaming that if he didn't act now, He would lose them both forever. But Valor stood firm. His eyes locked onto Harding's with a silent defiance, his battered body wedged against the failing beam, holding it up with nothing but sheer will as the weight of the world threatened to crush him. In that frozen moment, surrounded by the raging storm and the groaning bones of a dying house, Harding saw it, the sacrifice in Valor's eyes, the unwavering loyalty that had carried them through war zones and chaos, now standing between life and the final darkness. Time snapped back like a coiled spring as Harding let out a guttural roar, his boots churning through the rising water as he dove beneath the splintering wreckage, one arm wrapping around Valor's thick, trembling chest, while the other secured the child tight against him. With every ounce of strength left in his battered body, he heaved backward, his boots scraping for purchase against the flooded street, his mind consumed by a singular, desperate prayer. Don't let this be the end. The storm howled like a living beast as the entire structure came crashing down behind them, a monstrous wave of water and debris exploding into the air as the house folded into itself with a final, apocalyptic roar. The force of it threw them forward, Harding's body slamming into the hard ground as he shielded the girl and Valor with his own battered frame. For a heartbeat, there was nothing but darkness and the terrible silence that follows devastation. And then, air. Gasping, choking, Harding dragged himself upright, his arms shaking as he checked the girl first. Her tiny chest rose and fell in shallow, ragged breaths, her mud-smeared face pressed against his soaked jacket. Relief flooded through him so hard his vision swam. Then his eyes snapped to Valor. The dog lay motionless beside him, his chest rising in weak, shallow gasps, blood mixing with the rain as it flowed from a deep gash along his flank. "Stay with me, soldier," Harding rasped, his voice raw with emotion, his trembling hands pressed against Valor's wound, trying to staunch the bleeding as the storm continued its merciless assault. But even through the pain, Valor's eyes found Harding's, those familiar, unbreakable eyes that spoke of loyalty, of battles fought side by side, and of a bond forged in the crucible of life and death. And in that unspoken moment, amid the wreckage and ruin, Harding swore to Valor, the one promise that still mattered, he wasn't going to lose him. Not today, not ever. The rescue boat rocked violently against the swollen current as Harding dropped to his knees beside Valor's limp body, the storm's fury fading into a distant hum beneath the deafening roar of his own heartbeat. Rain pelted his back, mixing with the blood that still poured from Valor's torn side. The deep wound a cruel reminder of the price already paid for one small life saved. Harding pressed trembling hands against the gash, his calloused fingers slick with the warm, terrible truth that time was running out. "Don't you dare quit on me, Valor," he rasped, his forehead resting against the dog's blood-matted fur, his voice cracking under the weight of memories too heavy to bear. "You held the line. You did your part. Now you fight. You hear me? You fight!" The little girl sat huddled next to them, her thin arms still wrapped tightly around Valor's battered neck, her tear-filled eyes wide and haunted by the images of collapse and chaos. She couldn't begin to understand. Her voice trembled as she looked up at Harding, her small hands shaking. "He saved me," she whispered, as if speaking it aloud might keep the thread of life from slipping through their grasp. And in that moment, there was no distinction between man, beast, or child. There was only survival, raw and desperate. Beating against the relentless march of death, paramedics scrambled across the narrow deck, their hands working feverishly, pressing gauze against Valor's wounds, threading IV lines through fur matted with blood and grime, treating him with the same urgency and precision they'd given the most critical human patients. Harding clenched his jaws. He watched Valor's chest rise and fall in shallow, labored breaths, each one a battlefield of its own, a brutal war against the darkness creeping in. He could still hear the collapse behind them, the sickening crash of wood and steel falling into the floodwaters. And he knew, without this broken hero lying before him, that little girl wouldn't be breathing. And neither, he suspected, would he. The boat pitched again as it cut through the violent waters toward higher ground, the flashing lights of the emergency shelter barely visible through the curtain of rain. Harding never took his eyes off Valor, his hand pressed firmly over the wound, his lips moving in a silent prayer to a God he wasn't sure he believed in anymore. "Just hold on, buddy, just a little longer," he whispered, his throat raw, his heart breaking wide open. As Valor's eyes fluttered, unfocused but still fighting, still there. And for the first time since that storm began, Harding felt something more powerful than the fear and the chaos. He felt hope, a fragile, flickering hope carried on the broken breaths of a hero who refused to let go. And with that hope, Harding swore to himself that whatever came next, whatever it took, he would fight for Valor's life with the same reckless, relentless courage that Valor had shown for them all. Because sometimes, the ones who save us are the ones who need saving most. The hours dragged like a lifetime wrapped in darkness as the storm outside battered the fragile windows of the small clinic, the winds screaming through broken streets. While inside, the only sound that mattered was the slow, uncertain rhythm of the heart monitor beside the steel table where Valor lay motionless. His once proud chest barely rose beneath the weight of sedation and pain. His side wrapped in blood-soaked bandages that told a silent story of sacrifice no words could ever capture. Harding sat unmoving, his back aching, his hands raw and trembling as they rested gently. Over Valor's battered paw, the pads scarred from years of service, the muscles beneath them, once coiled with strength now slack and fragile under his fingers. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the dog who had given everything without hesitation, his mind replaying every moment of that terrible day, like a cruel film stuck on repeat. How Valor had stood against death itself, refusing to retreat, refusing to abandon the innocent life cradled in his protection even when the world collapsed around him. Outside, the rain lashed the streets as if the heavens themselves were weeping for those lost and those still fighting to survive. And with every flicker of lightning, Harding saw in his mind's eye the little girl's tear-streaked face pressed against Valor's neck. Her tiny voice whispering that he had saved her. That simple truth echoed through his heart louder than any storm, a reminder of the price paid by those who bear the burden of protection. News had come earlier that her family had been found huddled in the remains of a nearby shelter, their reunion a fragile moment of light in a night drowning in shadows. But even as others found their way back to safety, Harding remained at Valor's side, unwilling to believe that their fight was over, unwilling to accept that a hero like this could slip away unnoticed into the night. His fingers curled tighter around Valor's paws. The beeping monitor stuttered for a heartbeat too long, his breath catching in his throat as the room seemed to still, time pausing on the edge of unbearable loss before the faint rhythm returned, weak but defiant. Harding leaned forward, his forehead resting gently against Valor's, his voice a broken whisper in the sterile, dimly lit room. "You held the line, Valor. You fought for me. For her. For everyone. Now it's my turn, buddy. And I'm not letting go." His words hung heavy in the air as outside, the storm's rage slowly began to ease, the relentless downpour softening to a steady, mournful drizzle. But inside, the war waged on, the bond between soldier and dog holding fast through the long night, refusing to break, standing firm against the dark as it always had. And in that moment, Harding made a silent vow that no matter how long this night stretched on, he would fight for Valor's life with the same unrelenting courage that Valor had shown for them all. Because heroes don't fall alone, and this one wasn't going to fall at all. The first fragile light of dawn crept through the cracked blinds of the clinic, brushing the room in pale gold, as if the sun itself was holding its breath, waiting for the outcome of a battle waged in the shadows. Harding sat motionless, his head bowed against the cold edge of the operating table, his fingers still entwined, with Valor's unmoving paw. The hours of the night having stripped him down to nothing but raw hope and stubborn defiance. Then, in the quiet hum of the machines and the sterile scent of antiseptic, a sound broke through. A shallow, rasping breath that was more a whisper of life than a full claim to it. Harding's head snapped up, his eyes locking onto Valor's face just as the dog's lids fluttered open, slow and heavy, revealing those familiar, storm-worn eyes, dulled by pain but unmistakably alive. For a heartbeat, Harding couldn't breathe, the weight of fear and exhaustion crashing down all at once, forcing him to his knees beside the table as his chest tightened with a relief so fierce it was almost agony. "You stubborn old warrior," he choked out, his voice breaking as he pressed his forehead against Valor's, his free hand gently brushing back the fur from the dog's eyes. "You're still with me. You chose to fight." Valor's breath was weak, but steady now, his gaze tracking Harding's face, and in that silent exchange, every memory of battlefields crossed, lives saved, and sacrifices made pass between them like a promise renewed. Outside the clinic walls, the storm had spent its wrath, leaving behind a battered town that had somehow endured. Word of the rescue had spread like wildfire through the night, carried by trembling voices and shaky hands, dialing numbers to loved ones, until it reached beyond the flooded streets to places far removed from the storm's reach. Donations poured in from strangers who had seen their own hopes reflected in a soldier's broken plea and a dog's unyielding courage. Letters arrived by the hour, messages scrawled by children who had hugged their own pets tighter that night, by veterans who understood all too well the price of loyalty, and by mothers who couldn't bear to imagine a world where that little girl had been lost. Valor's fight had become their fight, his pulse against the darkness a beacon for everyone who needed to believe that heroes still stood between life and death even when the world seemed too far gone. Harding stayed by Valor's side as the day wore on, reading each letter aloud through the rough rasp of his voice, his thumb gently stroking the back of Valor's paw with every word spoken. And though the dog could not rise, though his body was battered and broken, his eyes held a flicker of something stronger than pain, a quiet, unbreakable resilience that had carried him through the worst night of their lives. And in that fragile dawn, amidst the echoes of prayers whispered across the nation, Harding knew with absolute certainty that this fight wasn't over. Valor had chosen life, and as long as there was breath in his body, Harding would make sure that choice was honored, no matter what it took. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm, golden light over a town that had learned to breathe again after drowning in chaos. The air still smelled faintly of mud and damp wood, but now it carried something else, hope. The streets bore the scars of the flood, buildings standing half repaired, and windows replaced with makeshift boards, and homes in the slow, painful process of resurrection. Amid the ruins, the sound of hammers and saws became a strange kind of music. The steady rhythm of survival beating against the backdrop of a tragedy that refused to define them. And through it all, Captain Harding walked with Valor at his side, their steps slow but steady, two soldiers bound by a war they had no choice but to fight. Valor's gait was uneven, his right side still tender beneath the bright blue bandage wrapped carefully over his ribs. But his head remained high, his eyes alert, his spirit untouched by the brokenness his body had endured. The metal pinned to his collar caught the afternoon light, glinting like a silent testament to the bravery that had rewritten the ending of a story that could have so easily ended in heartbreak. As they passed the town square, a place once submerged under raging waters, but now cleared of debris, Harding spotted her. Emily, the little girl whose life had become the living proof that courage could outlast even the worst of storms. She stood barefoot in the soft grass that had miraculously begun to grow back, her small hands clutching a wild bouquet of flowers, her smile brighter than the sun above. Without hesitation, she ran toward them, her feet kicking up little clouds of dust from the broken path her laughter ringing out like a melody Harding hadn't realized his heart had been longing to hear. "These are for my heroes," she called out, her arms flung wide as she threw herself at Valor, wrapping her tiny arms around his thick neck with the kind of affection that only the purest of hearts could give. Valor stood perfectly still, his tail wagging gently, his body leaning into her touch with the kind of trust only a true warrior could offer after walking through the fire and returning. Harding felt the sting of tears rise behind his eyes, the sight of that child embracing his battered partner breaking something open in him that had remained locked tight through years of battles, both foreign and domestic. He dropped to one knee beside them, his rough hand gently brushing Emily's tangled hair back from her face as she pressed the flowers into his free palm. "Thank you for bringing him back to me," she whispered softly, her voice so full of sincerity it made Harding's throat tighten painfully. He swallowed hard, his gaze lifting toward the horizon where the town's flag waved proudly once more against a sky washed clean by rain and time. And in that fragile, perfect moment, standing amid the ruins and the promise of rebuilding, Harding realized that survival wasn't just about enduring the storm, it was about finding the courage to step back into the light, no matter how dark the night had been. And with Valor at his side and Emily's hand in his, he knew they had found their way home. The years slipped by like pages torn from a book written in blood, rain, and resilience, but time could never wash away the memory of that night or the legend it gave birth to. The town, once broken and drowning beneath the weight of a storm that seemed too cruel to survive, stood proud again, its streets lined with new homes and gardens blooming where floodwaters once raged. But amid all the fresh paint and rebuilt walls, one monument stood untouched by time or weather. A statue cast in bronze, eternal and unyielding, rising from the heart of the town square. Valor captured forever in a moment of defiance against death itself. His body crouched low, muscles coiled, his eyes carved with a fierce, unwavering loyalty that seemed to watch over everyone who passed. His head tilted slightly toward the horizon as if still scanning for danger, still standing guard over the souls he'd fought to save. Children would stop to lay flowers at the base of the statue, their small fingers tracing the smooth lines of his face, their parents kneeling beside them to tell the story, the night the river tried to take everything, and a soldier's dog refused to let it happen. And every year, without fail, as the date of the storm's anniversary approached, and the skies threatened rain in a cruel reminder, Captain Luke Harding returned to that same square, his uniform pressed, his medals gleaming under a sky that always seemed just a little heavier on that day. He stood before the statue, with his shoulders squared against the memories that pressed down like the weight of the very flood they had survived, his hand resting over his heart, his fingers brushing against the faded ribbon tied around his wrist, the same ribbon that had once held a little girl's bouquet. Now frayed and fragile, but carried with him always, Harding's eyes would lift to meet the statue's gaze, and in the quiet that settled over the square despite the gathered crowds, he could almost feel it. That steady, faithful heartbeat that had once stood between life and death. The silent promise that no one was ever truly lost if they were remembered. And sometimes, when the breeze swept gently through the streets, carrying with it the scent of wildflowers and the soft laughter of children who no longer lived in fear, Harding would swear he heard it. That deep, steady pant, the quiet shuffle of paws against stone, the presence of a guardian who never really left. Because in every corner of that town, in every home rebuilt stronger than before, in every heart that still beat despite the night that tried to take them, the legend of valor lived on. And as Harding stood there, year after year, his chest aching with both pride and sorrow, he knew the truth as deeply as he'd known it that night amidst the raging waters. Heroes do rise in the darkest storms, and some of the greatest among them walk on four legs, their courage etched not only in stone, but in the very soul of those they save.